powerful and significant civilization that existed for more than 1,000 years was the Roman Empire. But when its rule came to a close, inflation caused a serious economic crisis. In this video, we'll explore the causes of inflation, the effects it had on the economy, and its effects on the poor, middle class, and wealthy. Inflation, what is it? Let's first define inflation before getting into the facts of how it destroyed the Roman economy. A prolonged upward trend in the average price of goods and services over a given period is referred to as inflation. It lessens a currency's ability to buy things and lowers the value of savings. Let's analyze inflation in more detail. Inflation, which lowers the purchasing power of money, is a measure of the rate at which prices for goods and services are growing generally. When an economy's money supply expands more quickly than its capacity to generate goods and services, inflation results. As a result, there is more money vying for fewer goods and services, which raises the price of those items. In the case of the Roman Empire, it can also result in social and political upheaval. How did Rome's inflation begin? Inflation started in Rome for a number of reasons. First off, the Roman economy depended largely on conquest to amass wealth and was focused on agriculture and trade. Rome was able to produce coins as it expanded its conquest because it had access to fresh sources of precious metals. Without a comparable rise in goods and services, this resulted in an increase in the money supply. The Roman government also had a sizable, intricate bureaucracy that cost a lot of money to run. The economy was hampered by the government's need to pay for the army, public works projects, and other costs. The government resorted to debasing its currency, which involves lowering the amount of precious metal in each coin to pay for these costs. This resulted in a devaluation of the currency, but also allowed the government to print more coins. The use of slave labor was another aspect of Rome that led to inflation. Because slaves were an inexpensive source of labor, the Romans had less incentive to develop new ideas and make technological investments. Low productivity and economic stagnation were the results of this. The Roman economy heavily relied on slavery, which gave the Romans access to inexpensive labor for a variety of industries like agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. Slaves were not compensated for their labor and were viewed as property. The Romans had access to a large labor pool due to their reliance on slave labor, which resulted in an overabundance of goods and services. This ultimately resulted in lower pricing, which made it challenging for businesses and farmers to turn a profit. Many companies had to reduce costs in order to counteract the low prices, which frequently resulted in a decline in product quality. In addition, the low pricing reduced investment and innovation. The Roman economy stalled because there was little incentive to raise productivity or make investments in new technology. This resulted in a lack of economic growth along with an abundance of products and services. The system of slave labor further widened the gap between the rich and the poor in terms of income. The majority of the slave labor was under the control of wealthy landowners and aristocracy, giving them considerable economic and political power. As a result of their limited access to resources and opportunities, the poor experienced poverty and social unrest. The usage of slave labor resulted in a demographic crisis in addition to these problems. There was little motivation for the Romans to have big families or to spend money on the population's education and training because they relied on slaves to create goods and services. As a result, the population fell, which had a big effect on the economy. The government implemented price restrictions in an effort to curb inflation as it grew, but these measures proved ineffectual. Due to the pricing limits, there was a lack of goods and services, which caused many businesses to fail. As a result, trade and commerce suffered, further escalating the economic crisis. The poor, middle class, and wealthy people in Rome all suffered greatly as a result of the inflation crisis. The poor were particularly heavily struck since they could not buy items like food and clothing. The economy squeezed out the middle class, and many small company owners were compelled to close their doors. Even the wealthy were impacted because the value of their investments and possessions fell. The Roman economy grew more unstable as inflation climbed steadily. Different groups, the poor, middle class, and wealthy, were impacted. The poor inflation disproportionately affected the poor. Their ability to buy even the simplest basics decreased due to the skyrocketing prices of basic necessities like food and clothing. This caused widespread starvation and hardship, and many individuals turned to crime as a means of survival. Inflation in ancient Rome had a particularly negative impact on the poor. Their purchasing power decreased as costs increased, making it harder for them to afford necessities like food and clothing. Their wages did not keep up with the rising cost of living, which resulted in inflation, which reduced the value of their earnings. The impoverished experienced some of their greatest sufferings as a result of rising food prices. Most Romans spent the majority of their income on food, and as costs increased, the poor found it increasingly impossible to buy even the most basic necessities like bread and vegetables. A significant component of bread, wheat's price rose to the point where many people needed government assistance to survive. A reduction in the availability of products and services was another effect of inflation. The rising cost of production made it difficult for retailers to remain in business, and many were compelled to raise their prices. This resulted in a shortage of products and services, making it harder for the impoverished to get the requirements for survival. In addition, housing was also impacted by inflation. Rents climbed along with costs, making it challenging for the poor to obtain affordable homes. Many were compelled to live in subpar housing or lose their homes. Finally, violence and social instability were also influenced by inflation. The more desperate the impoverished became, the more likely it was that they would resort to crime or insurrection to get what they needed to survive. Increased social tensions and violence followed as a result. In conclusion, the impoverished in ancient Rome suffered greatly from inflation. They found it more and more difficult to pay for necessities like food, clothing, and housing as costs increased and their purchasing power decreased. The lack of commodities and services brought on by inflation made life for the impoverished increasingly harder. In the end, inflation fueled social discontent and violence, which made the misery of the poor even worse. The middle class inflation had a significant negative impact on the middle class. Their purchasing power fell as the cost of goods and services rose, making it difficult for them to maintain their level of living. The middle class was squeezed out of the economy as many small business owners were compelled to close their doors. They nonetheless suffered, even though they were not as badly affected as the poor. They were nonetheless negatively impacted by the rising expense of life and the lack of goods and services, despite not being as negatively as the poor. The middle class suffered in many ways, but one of the most notable was a decline in purchasing power. They struggled more and more to maintain their level of living as prices increased. They had less discretionary income to spend on other goods and services since they had to pay more for basic necessities. The deterioration in the caliber of goods and services also had an impact on the middle class. Merchants frequently compromised on quality in order to maintain competitive prices as they tried to keep up with the rising cost of production. Due to this, middle-class consumers had to pay extra for poor quality products. Savings and investments were impacted by inflation as well. The value of money fell as prices increased, making it more challenging for the middle class to invest in enterprises or save money. This ultimately caused economic growth and prosperity to slow down. Inflation fueled political turmoil and societal unrest. As the middle class struggled, they were more prone to participate in uprisings and rallies with the poor. The stability of the government and the economy was consequently put at risk. At last, the middle class in ancient Rome suffered greatly from inflation. They suffered from a fall in savings and investments, a loss of purchasing power, and lower quality goods and services. Political turbulence and societal discontent that challenged the stability of the government and the economy were also a result of inflation. The rich, even the wealthy, were susceptible to inflation's impacts. They were still wealthy, but the devaluation of the currency reduced their wealth. Many of them struggled to maintain their opulent lifestyles as the value of their possessions dropped. Inflation had a very different effect on the wealthy in ancient Rome than it did on the lower and middle classes. The wealthy were frequently able to expand their fortune and gain from inflation. Investments were one way that the wealthy were able to profit from inflation. They were able to invest as prices soared in properties, businesses, and other assets whose value grew in step with inflation. As a result, their wealth grew despite a decline in the value of the dollar. Furthermore, individuals who had a lot of debt benefited from inflation. They were better able to fulfill their responsibilities since as the value of money fell, so did the value of their debts. By taking advantage of the inflationary atmosphere, this assisted the wealthy in maintaining and even increasing their wealth. On the other hand, inflation did also have certain drawbacks for the wealthy. On the other hand, inflation did also have certain drawbacks for the wealthy. They found it harder to maintain their quality of living because costs for luxury items and services increased at the same time as those for essentials. They had to pay more for their lifestyle as a result, which reduced their purchasing power. The safety and security of the wealthy were challenged by growing social discontent and political instability brought on by inflation. The wealthy were frequently targeted in protests, riots, and uprisings because they were thought to be the root of the Roman Empire's financial crisis. So the demise of the Roman Empire was greatly influenced by inflation. If you enjoyed watching the video, please remember to subscribe. Don't forget to like and comment for more great content about history and culture. Thank you for watching this video.